Beyond the Gates spoilers teased that Samantha's first real kiss would arrive quietly and with far more consequence than anyone expected. It was not cinematic, no fleeing rain, no grand orchestral swell, but a small, intimate moment that cracked an entire household's fragile calm in ways that would echo for weeks. She had brought him home like a nervous courier transporting something precious but fragile, a teenage ritual wrapped in adult embarrassment. A secret she wanted to keep private and safe. That evening, the apartment smelled like reheated pasta and laundry detergent, the couch had an indentation from years of argument and television, and Kat sat in the kitchen, a cigarette-less ritual of anxiety folded into her hands. She had been in the thick of a bad month, bad in the way that accumulative small humiliations are bad. So when Samantha opened the door, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with a secret she had never told, Kat felt a hot, invasive mix of pride and a prickling, unfamiliar shame. The boy, call him Smitty, or Sam's shy namesake, was neither polished nor suspicious. He was earnest and clumsy and smiled in that way that made Samantha's mouth shape a secret. They sat on the couch like two conspirators, knees touching, voices hushed. For Kat, watching them was a revelation and a wound. She had been in proximity to young love before and had seen its simple beginnings bloom into dull routines or catastrophes. She remembered her own first kiss as if it were a currency, paid for in risk, spent on memory. That night, Samantha's kiss was a small, bright theft of immediacy to lips, a hush. Kat saw it all with the magnified cruelty of someone whose life had been hollowed out by betrayal and expectancy. She'd been on edge, an eye always on the door, the other on a pattern of alliances forming and unforming in their circle. If she had been kinder, she might have smiled and left the young couple their privacy. But she was brittle, raw from the scrape of recent gossip and the family's internal politics. When she stood and walked into the living room, it was under the pretense of making tea. But what she found was two people caught mid-softness, and something in her chest shifted in a way that had nothing to do with them. Samantha, startled, stepped back as if the kiss had been interrupted by lightning. The boy fled awkwardly, cheeks burning, dignity frayed, leaving a silence that trembled between furniture and floor. She grabbed at Kat, whispering in a voice thick with pleading, "Please. Please don't tell Martin." She was not asking because she feared punishment alone. Samantha's fear was an adult thing disguised as adolescent panic. She knew the family's lines of fire, how secrets could escalate into violence or ruin a fragile truce, and she wanted to contain this spark before it became an inferno. Kat's anger, when it hit, felt less like righteous fury and more like a personal indictment. She felt humiliated, as if two people could sit where she had sat and not feel the extent of the family's expectations, the history of judgment that shadowed every Dupree name. She had watched couples in the building laugh and touch and continually be invited into the kind of complacency she hated. Now, Samantha's small betrayal turned into a mirror. In her mind, there was a gallery of face-sure mothers, her sisters, her own, and Samantha's kiss was a new etching in that gallery. One she didn't ask for. Their fight was swift and sharp, a domestic argument that felt disproportionate to the occasion. Samantha insisted it was just a kiss, a thing easier to trivialize when you have the luxury of not seeing the long-term scaffolding of family reputation. Kat accused her of recklessness, of being naive, of playing at love while the adults circled like vultures. The accusations accrued over minutes into a litany. "You don't understand, you don't see. You don't care." Samantha's voice shook, not from anger but the exhaustion of being chewed by someone she trusted. She didn't want Martin to know because Martin's brand of justice was the kind that left scars, literal ones. Kat's choice to tell Martin, despite Samantha's tearful pleas, was not purely vengeance. It was a reflexive attempt to create order where she felt none. She could have protected the secret, absorbed the awkwardness, counseled Samantha, let life continue. Instead, she stepped into the role that often defined her relationship to the family, the one who enforced boundaries. She believed that the contemplation of what Martin might do would sober Samantha, would make her realize that small mistakes weren't harmless and could be used by enemies. But the truth is also that Kat envied Samantha's freedom, and that envy often mutates into strictness. So she told Martin, choosing loyalty to a different kind of order over a child's trust. When Martin learned, His reaction was a flash of instinctual violence. He didn't speak so much as lunge, a man acting on impulse rather than thought. Smith's boy found himself punched, stunned, more humiliated by the sight of anger than by pain. The room closed in with the sound of fists and the metallic ting of fear. Neighbors would later describe it as sudden and alarming. Smitty, who had probably come to the apartment safe in the naive belief that the world would tolerate adolescent missteps, left with a bruise and a story that turned casual affection into a lesson he had not intended to learn. Smitty, in the hours after, replayed the moment not through the eyes of the blasted cheek or the blood, but through the calculus of human error. He thought, Martin is capable of this. Martin's temper is a fault line that could split at any time. He wondered whether this was the kind of man who would make a mistake and keep making them habitually, disastrously. Seeing the ease with which Martin's fist moved made Smitty reflect on the family he'd unintentionally entered and the dangers of being close to its tensions. He wondered, too, if Martin's weakness could be manipulated, that vulnerability alert, bruised, and ready to explode he could be bait for someone like Joey. Joey, in the small orbit of the Dupree neighborhood, had a reputation for reading people before they knew themselves. He was the kind of man who saw patterns where others saw chaos and used them like a locksmith uses a ring of keys. He noticed the fissures in Martin's behavior, logged them, and began to circle with the intent of integrating them into his advantage. Smitty's fear that Martin could be set up by Joey was not paranoia. It was an accurate reading of a man with a talent for exploitation. Joey could make the emotional liability of Martin into a public spectacle that would serve his own means, whether that meant leverage, blackmail, or a more subtle undermining of Martin's credibility in the community. The dynamics shifted further when Eva came into focus, not as a mere presence but as an active agent trying to wedge herself into Thomas and Kat's fragile attempts at normalcy. Thomas, who had no deep understanding of the Dupree pedigree and who often saw relationships through his own gentle, naive lens, tried to mediate. He offered kind words, tried to be the voice of reason. Maybe she's just insecure, he told Kat one night, supposing that Eva might be flattered rather than malicious. Thomas didn't carry the memory of Eva's mother, the tangled history of ambition and brimstone. He did not see the patterns that made Kate react like she did. In his eyes, this was a garden dispute. In Kat's eyes, it was a strategic war over lineage and entitlement. Eva, deft and practiced, presented a softer front to Thomas. She knew how to smile in ways that made people let down their guard. To those around her who didn't know the legacy of her name, she appeared charming, a little needy, a plausible romantic interest for a man like Thomas. But Kat saw past the smile to the fingerprints of maternal influence. She read Eva like a book with a hidden index, the posture, the echo of lessons learned in a home that prized winning over conscience, the skill at extracting sympathy like an artist extracts pigment. Kat's language in calling Eva like her mother a whore who takes what belongs to others came not from a simple desire to insult but from years of inherited contempt and a code that valued family honor above compassion. Her words were harsh, yes, and they burned, but they were also loaded with an economy of grievance. The Dupree's notion that lineage defines boundaries and that some people are forever outside the fold. Thomas, taken aback by Kat's vehemence, tried to reason. "You don't have to call her that," he said quietly, trying to disarm the fury with a gentle, rational voice. But Kat's history with Eva's family had taught her to be immediate and merciless in defense. Her warning, explicit and cruel, was meant to mark boundaries. Eva and Leslie would never be recognized as Duprees. In that shorthand lay a claim to identity and the right to decide who belonged. Kat's insistence that Eva would never be admitted into their name was as much an act of desperation as it was of identity politics. It was a defense mechanism designed to protect a family that had been bruised and therefore needed armor. Eva, sensing danger, shifted. Where before she had been a flat and sincere, now she allowed a hardness to edge her smile. She had learned from her mother that sometimes, gentility must give way to cunning. She understood the high cost of rejection and the lengths one takes to be accepted. To Thomas she was magnetic and conciliatory. To Kat, She was a threat. That duplicity is what made Eva dangerous in Kat's view. The way Eva hid a ravenous ambition behind the mask of neediness was a skill that made Tomas see only one version of her, the one that courted his affection and seemed to complement Kat's rougher edges. Kat's fury then became, in Tomas's eyes, unnecessary jealousy, and in Kat's eyes, Tomas's naivete was betrayal by omission. None of these social storms existed in isolation. They bled into the question of Ted and where Kat positioned herself in relation to him. Ted, already a contentious figure, unsteady, compromised by past sycophancies and betrayal, had been courting a return to family favor. There were rumors that he sought to be reaccepted by his mother, to regain the kind of patronage that would magnetize him back into respectability. Kat had, at one point, supported the idea of helping him. She had believed in rehabilitation, in giving someone a second chance because that was the noble response, or so it had seemed. But after what she had witnessed, Samantha's innocence crushed by adult scorn, Martin's violent reflexes exposed, the ease with which outsiders like Eva and Leslie manipulated vulnerabilities, Kat began to think differently. Ted's presence in the family was no longer neutral. It was an accelerant. She started creating distance, not out of cruelty, but out of an assessment. Ted's appetite for convenience and validation made him unworthy of the Dupree honor she believed in. To her, being Dupree was not merely a matter of blood but of a code, to stand firm, to be a rock when life demanded it. Ted's weakness as penchant to lean on others for identity made him an unstable candidate for reintegration. Her withdrawal was quiet but absolute. She stopped texting in the morning. She planted little deferrals in conversation that made others see that she was not on board. Nicolai, an unyielding arbiter of grace and a woman who had been wronged by other men, might have once coaxed reconciliation. But Kat now saw reconciliation as dangerous. A surrender that would allow people like Leslie to think they could rewrite the rules. She feared a domino effect. Accept Ted back and you signal the culture that weakness is tolerable. That would create openings for people like Eva and Leslie to insert themselves with impunity. As the small family drama swelled, the neighborhood watched with the voracious, judgmental appetite of a community that treats others' pain as its entertainment and instruction. People took sides in the way they place bets quietly and with hope they are aligned with the inevitable winner. For Smitty, the lesson was the cost of affection. For Samantha, the lesson was the brutality of secrets. For Kat, it was the reminder that heritage is both shield and prison. For Tomas, it was how innocence can be mistaken for naivete. For Eva, it was the calculus of acceptance and the complex art of disguise. For Martin, it was a moment that revealed his temper and opened him to manipulation by Joey. For Ted, it was the thin cliff edge of reputation where one misstep could cast him out for good. The pressures bent everyone toward decisions they would come to regret or, perhaps, to salvation. Alliances were not simple. Loyalties had been bought and bartered for years. And what appeared to be a straightforward conflict over a kiss was actually a proxy for deeper battles over identity, dignity, and power. The room where Samantha had kissed and been discovered was, in a sense, a crucible. It revealed who the players were, what they prioritized, and the lengths they would go to maintain or acquire control. The night closed on no sense of resolution. Instead, doors slammed softly across the building and neighbors whispered, and the echo of a single kiss expanded into a storm that had only begun. Kat lay awake, folding the events over in her head, feeling less like she had enforced boundaries and more like she had started something that might not be contained. Samantha apologized again and again, thin as breath. Smitty considered leaving town quietly, his bruise visible and his pride quietly rearranged. Martin kept to himself, pacing, his anger smoldering but not extinguished. Joey watched, like a predator waiting for the right ripple. And somewhere, quietly, the idea of entitlement and the hunger for recognition, what Eva and Leslie both desired in different ways, grew teeth. The fight lines were drawn, the players had made moves. But the full gambit trap Joey might set for Martin, the decision Kat would finally make about Ted, the way Tomas would react to being told the ugly truth about an adored neighbor remained undone, suspended in the air like a held breath. The story, trimmed at the throat by a single kiss, was not finished. It had only opened. Martin's rage had opened a door he could not easily close, and in the days that followed, the entire circle felt the aftershocks. Smitty kept his distance, but the story of the punch traveled fast, becoming a symbol of Martin's volatility. Whispers grew louder that he was a man who led with his fists rather than his judgment, and those whispers were exactly the kind of thing Joey knew how to turn into a weapon. Joey began circling Martin with the precision of a chess player waiting for his opponent to falter again. He dropped casual remarks, baited him with half-truths, and set traps that looked like opportunities. Martin's temper became both his shield and his vulnerability, and Joey's patience suggested he would strike when Martin least expected. Samantha felt the pressure of her mistake doubling. She had wanted only a small taste of romance, a kiss that meant little outside of her heart, yet it had spiraled into a mess involving violence and rumors. She watched Martin unravel and feared she had become the root of his downfall. Her guilt pressed heavily, but she was also angry at Kat. The betrayal of having her secret exposed gnawed at her more than the embarrassment of being caught. When she confronted Kat again, her words were sharper than before. She accused Kat of using her kiss as a weapon in the family's ongoing wars. Kat, defensive and exhausted, denied it, but her denial rang hollow. Both knew the truth. Kat had chosen power over protection. Meanwhile, Kat's battles were multiplying. Thomas began to drift, unsettled by the constant tension between Kat and Eva. He couldn't reconcile the venom Kat spat with the warmth Eva showed him. To Thomas, Eva seemed misunderstood, a victim of Kat's harshness. Eva, calculating as always, leaned into that perception. She began spending more time with Thomas, carefully planting doubts about Kat's intentions, casting herself as the reasonable one. Slowly, she pulled him into her orbit, and Thomas, unaware of the game, allowed himself to believe that Eva was different from her mother, that maybe she could be trusted. Kat saw it happening and felt powerless to stop it. Every attempt to warn Thomas only painted her as paranoid, jealous, even cruel. Her insistence that Eva was cut from the same cloth as Leslie began to sound like bitterness, and Thomas recoiled. This distance made Kat lash out further, creating a cycle that only deepened Thomas's sympathy for Eva. The more Kat fought, the more she lost ground, and Eva, with her mask of sweetness, gained what she had long wanted, the attention and perhaps even the affection of Thomas. The Dupree Code weighed heavily on Kat during these moments. She had always believed in defending the family name, drawing sharp lines between insiders and outsiders. Yet she was beginning to realize that not everyone shared that conviction. To her, Ted's weakness was a betrayal of what it meant to be a Dupree, a man unwilling to stand firm when his family needed him. Her growing disdain for him mirrored her fury with Eva. Both, in her mind, embodied the same corruption, one through dependence, the other through manipulation. She withdrew further from Ted, making it clear he was no longer welcome under her protection. Ted, already fragile from Nicole's rejection, felt the sting of Kat's withdrawal deeply. He had thought of her as an ally, perhaps even the one person who might understand him. Losing her approval left him adrift, clinging harder to Leslie's chaotic embrace. But Leslie's satisfaction was cruelly superficial. She enjoyed flaunting her hold over Ted, but Nicole's dismissive words lingered, that Ted was nothing more than a test, a pawn, a man who mistook weakness for intimacy. Leslie had gotten what she wanted, but even she began to sense that Ted was a hollow prize. Back in the household, the tension between Samantha and Kat reached a breaking point. Samantha refused to be silenced anymore. She told Martin directly that his violence had only made everything worse, that his fist had said more about him than her kiss ever could. Martin, wounded by her words, lashed out again physically, but with accusations. He claimed she had betrayed the family by bringing outsiders too close. Their argument carved a fissure that would not easily mend, leaving both hurt and angry, with Joey still watching from the sidelines, ready to exploit the fracture. Eva's influence over Thomas grew to the point where he began to consider her version of events as truth. He questioned Kat's anger, wondered if maybe she was exaggerating the dangers of Eva's ambition. Eva, careful not to overplay her hand, assured him she wanted nothing but peace, but she planted subtle dots about Kat's ability to control her temper. Thomas, caught between two women, felt himself drifting further from Kat, and with every step he took toward Eva, Kat's fear of history repeating itself grew sharper. The unspoken rivalry between Eva and Kat soon became impossible to ignore. Their barbed exchanges, their cutting remarks, their battles over Thomas's attention, each encounter chipped away at the fragile balance in the family. And all the while, Kat's disdain for Ted and her refusal to support his attempts at reconciliation with Nicole marked a turning point. She realized that some connections could not and should not be repaired. Ted's failures were too glaring, his dependence too suffocating. To Kat, the only way forward was to sever ties, no matter how brutal the cut. As these threads pulled tighter, the air grew heavy with the promise of escalation. Samantha, caught between guilt and defiance, sought a way to reclaim her voice. Martin, blind to his own flaws, edged closer to Joey's trap. Thomas, gentle but naive, drifted dangerously toward Eva's charm. Kat, weary yet unyielding, prepared to fight both Eva and Ted to protect what she believed was the honor of her name. And Eva, smiling behind her mask, sharpened her strategy, knowing she was closer than ever to the recognition she craved but had been denied all her life. The battles were no longer private squabbles. They had become declarations of identity, loyalty, and power. Every choice carried weight, every word was a move in a larger game, and the family's fragile foundation trembled under the strain. The storm that had begun with a kiss now gathered force, pulling everyone into its path, promising that none of them would escape unchanged. The tension in the Dupree world had reached a point where every breath felt like a prelude to conflict, every glance loaded with suspicion. The fragile threads between Samantha, Kat, Martin, Thomas, Eva, Ted, and Leslie had been stretched to breaking, and the choices each of them made now would determine not just their own futures but the fate of the family name they all clung to, rejected, or manipulated in their own ways. Samantha, once timid under Kat's scrutiny, began to find a strength born out of exhaustion. She was tired of being the scapegoat, tired of carrying the guilt of a kiss that had spiraled into violence and betrayal. She decided that silence was no longer her ally. Instead of begging Kat for discretion or shielding Martin from the truth of his actions, she began to speak openly. She confided in others about Martin's temper, about the way he let his fists answer for his insecurities. The more she spoke, the more she realized how many others had seen the same patterns. Samantha's voice, trembling at first, grew steadier. She became not just the girl with a secret but the one willing to tell the truth no matter how messy. Martin, however, could not bear the unraveling of his image. Every whisper that circulated through the neighborhood felt like a blade at his back. Joey, ever patient, fed Martin's insecurities with carefully chosen words. He suggested that Samantha was turning people against him, that Kat was disappointed in him, that Thomas pitied him, and that Eva saw him as a failure. The more Martin listened, the more paranoid he became. He believed Joey's lies because they confirmed his own darkest fears. The trap was set, and Martin walked willingly into it, convinced he had to prove his strength once again. Kat, meanwhile, fought wars on too many fronts. Her anger at Samantha had cooled into a quiet regret, though her pride kept her from admitting it. With Thomas drifting closer to Eva, Kat's desperation only grew. She tried to remind him of their bond, of the history they shared, of the storms they had weathered together. But Thomas saw her pleas as control, her warnings as obsession. Eva had painted herself as the calm alternative, the one who listened without judgment, and Thomas found comfort in that illusion. For Kat, it was like watching a slow theft she could not stop. Her fury sharpened into a vow: she would not let Eva rewrite history, nor would she let the Dupree name be tainted by those who only pretended to value it. Eva thrived in the shadows of Kat's outbursts. Every time Kat lost her temper, Eva gained another inch of ground. She positioned herself carefully, never too aggressive, never too obvious, but always close enough to Thomas to make her presence undeniable. She reminded him of the simple things Kat had forgotten: kindness, laughter, patience. Yet beneath her charm was a hunger that never dimmed. She wanted more than Thomas's attention, she wanted legitimacy, the recognition that Kat swore she would never have. For Eva, this was not just about love but about power. About finally being seen as something more than an outsider. Ted and Leslie, once the scandal of Nicole's world, began to realize that their victory was hollow. Ted clung to Leslie, desperate to find meaning in her approval, but he found only emptiness. Leslie, triumphant at first, grew restless. She had proven her point, had disrupted Nicole's life, had claimed Ted as her prize. But now what? Nicole's dismissive words haunted her, that Ted was nothing more than a pawn, a man incapable of standing on his own. Leslie began to wonder if she had bound herself to someone who could never be more than a shadow. The thrill of conquest faded, leaving her with a hollow echo where satisfaction should have been. The climax came not in one grand confrontation but in a series of small, explosive moments that collided like sparks in dry grass. Martin, goaded by Joey's manipulations, lashed out again, this time at someone who would not stay silent. His violence, once hidden behind closed doors, spilled into public view. Neighbors saw it. Thomas saw it. Even Eva, who had tried to keep her hands clean, could not ignore it. The image of Martin as a strong protector shattered, leaving only the truth, a man consumed by his temper, easy to manipulate, and dangerous to everyone around him. Samantha, emboldened by the chaos, stood firm. She told her story again, louder this time, and for once she was not dismissed. People listened. They believed her. And in believing her, they began to see Kat differently too, not as the unyielding enforcer but as someone who had sacrificed Samantha's trust for the sake of family pride. Kat, for all her fury, had to face the reality that her rigid defense of the Dupree name had cost her the very relationships she wanted to protect. Thomas, caught in the middle, finally saw through Eva's mask. It happened subtly, an overheard conversation, a slip of the tongue, but it was enough. He realized that Eva's kindness had always been calculated, her affectionate tool. The betrayal cut deep, not because of what Eva had done, but because of how blind he had been to it. He returned to Kat, not with open arms but with questions, with doubt, with the fragile hope that what they had could be salvaged if she could learn to trust rather than control. Eva, exposed but unbroken, did not grumble. Instead, she hardened. She swore that Kat's rejection would not be the end of her. If the Duprees would not recognize her, she would carve out her own legacy, one built not on family honor but on ambition and resilience. Leslie, too, found herself at a crossroads. Ted's weakness, once amusing, now suffocated her. She realized that clinging to him meant sharing his downfall, and Leslie Dupree was never meant to be dragged down. She began to plan her escape, leaving Ted to face the consequences of his choices alone. In the end, the Dupree world did not collapse, it transformed. Samantha emerged stronger, no longer the girl defined by a secret kiss but a young woman who had faced betrayal and found her voice. Martin, undone by his own fists and Joey's manipulations, became a cautionary tale, a man remembered not for his strength but for his weakness. Kat, scarred but unbroken, began to learn that love could not be defended with anger alone, that sometimes protecting a name meant letting go of control. Thomas, wiser now, walked beside her with cautious steps, willing to rebuild but unwilling to forget. Eva, denied yet defiant, set her sights on a future where she no longer needed their approval. And Ted, abandoned even by Leslie, stood alone, a man who had gambled everything on weakness and lost. The storm had passed, but its scars remained. The Duprees, fractured and redefined, stood at the threshold of something new. Some had found strength, others ruin, but all of them had been changed. The kiss that had started it all became a memory, not of innocence lost, but of the moment the gates opened and everyone had to decide who they truly were when faced with betrayal, ambition, and truth.